Open University.
Greetings, my educational guinea pigs, and I want to talk with you today about photography and my own interest in photography and my photographic habit of uploading usually about 10 pictures a day to my Tumblr page. And it feels to me as if when I use Tumblr I've taken a vow of silence, because I used to blog on LiveJournal, and that would involve illustration of a text. Basically, I would use 550 pixel images, some of which were other people's images and some of which were my own, to illustrate a particular theme I was writing and thinking about. Tumblr is not the same at all. It's really, I've identified it as a place for visual people, and visual people are a bit like monks in that they've taken a vow of silence. They have opted to show rather than to tell, and that means communicating visually. And it's also a cultural split between, say, people who went to art school, which is largely a visual culture, and people who went to, as I did, university and studied literature. So it's weird, how come I, as a literary, word-based person, have taken this vow of silence along with the Tumblr art school folk? And I think it's partly because limitation is a kind of opportunity. I think if you take that vow of silence, you really have to pack a lot into the limited form you've chosen, which is still images. Still images are not time-based media, as they would say in art school. It's not music, it's not film, not video. And that's very important. I think the idea of a snap being a moment in time, which can be quickly consumed, is an important one for the way we browse and nibble at the internet today. Actually, it's very boring to look back at your archives of old shaky kind of ugly bits of video. Somehow they don't isolate a moment in such a clean and clear and beautiful way as a still image. So I've taken increasingly view movies, and I tend to ignore the movie function of my digital still cameras, if they have one. At the moment my equipment is a Fujifilm X Pro 1, which is a fairly good still camera with a movie facility, which I use. Actually, I use that camera now more for doing these Open University broadcasts and doing the filming part of that. And actually, when I go out and do street photography, travel photography, I tend to use the iPhone more. Although it's quite a poor camera, and it's particularly poor in low light, it's much better for being unobtrusive, because everybody has a smartphone and everyone expects you to be brandishing one, and they don't really feel self-conscious when you have one. Whereas if you have a thing that looks like an old-fashioned camera, which the X Pro 1 does, it puts people up very much on their guard, and it makes you look more like a tourist as well. It's like the old-fashioned image of a tourist. So the kind of things which catch my eye when I'm out doing my street photography have become obvious. It's funny, I was just reading Dickon Edwards quoting a Virginia Woolf diary entry in which she's 46 years old, as he is now as well. And she says, I'm kind of bored with my own thoughts, and other people are bored with me because they know what I'm going to say before I say it. And in a way, I sort of feel that about my photography, but I also feel that it's become a perfect, ultra-efficient machine for expressing my interests, my photographic interests anyway. But I do tend to photograph the same things over and over again, and they would be, for example, plastic chairs, tiled floors, people dressed up in ways that make them look Asian and exotic, simultaneously if possible. They would be paperback books, old, avant-garde European paperbacks from the mid-20th century. There would be hazard and safety gear, there would be a certain kind of brutalist architecture, and certain colour combinations, warm colours, the palette of the late 60s and early 70s, oranges and pinks, especially pink. Myself, selfies, with me dressed in ways that make me look exotic, things made of plastic, trains, fruit, and things that look like art installations and biennials. So I've kind of been trained by the contemporary art that I appreciate. So in a way, I've been thinking about this in terms of Pierre Bourdieu's class, ponderings in books like Distinction, and am I just kind of using photography to express my cultural capital, as he would have put it, and to talk about that my eye has been trained by particular things, but it's also an expression of my cultural values, which are my class values, and is it really more than that? And I could, as a counter-argument, I could say, well, listen, my brother and sister had the same upbringing as I did, and they don't take these kind of photographs. They have a different eye. Or I could look at, say, other musicians who travel and take photographs, like David Sylvian publishes his photographs quite a lot to his, I guess, his Instagram or his Twitter. They're quite a different proposition to mine. I don't know, I find him clunkily arty in a kind of coffee table way. I don't know how you'd describe mine. I suppose they're a kind of notebook of my particular interests, things that leap up to my eye and the things I want to share. And they are all to do with finding an interest in non-Western aesthetics or non-Northern aesthetics, you know, sort of South v North, a kind of repudiation of Puritanism combined with a Puritan outlook, a bit the Puritan kind of idea of, you know, it's difficult to make direct connections, but I would say, for instance, framing a person, I always do my selfies full length with a certain kind of flat lighting, and that's in itself a Puritan. I think of August Zander taking his work photographs of German workers in the early 20th century, for instance. That's a kind of Puritan framing, because it's basically giving a simple, full-on kind of informative look at something, which becomes in itself, it's a functional aesthetic, but it's also an aesthetic of function. Or the way I prefer, you know, certain kind of stark book jacket design, or, you know, these are kind of Protestant values, but I'm also escaping. It's a kind of dialectic of Protestantism, because I'm also interested in sensuality or a brightness of colour which escapes. I do think my palette expresses a kind of humanism or a kind of liberalism. It's avoiding blue, greys, blacks, whites and metallic sort of textures, and looking more to golds and yellows and reds and pinks, oranges, the kind of colours that the world used to be when I was growing up. Maybe, you know, certain influence from the late 60s and early 70s for sure. But some of the talk I've recently picked up about it is designers talking about the repudiation, the recent redesign of Lufthansa's livery, the German airline, and they used to use a lot of yellow, which has now been eradicated in favour of dark blue and white. And some designers were saying that this represented first of all, a blanding out and a kind of conformism, because a lot of American airlines, for instance, used to have beautiful colours, Paul Rand logos and fantastic oranges and pinks and purples and things, their 70s livery, and then they have gone to this sort of blue and white, disgracefully cold livery. So people are saying that the getting rid of the yellow for Lufthansa's new look has been politically a step towards coldness, clinical feeling, lack of warmth, a lack of generosity. Photography has this way of being able to communicate things non-explicitly, just by implication. The way you frame things, the way you choose things out in the world. You see, this is the other thing about being bored with your own vision, your own image of the world. Photography kind of militates against that, because if you're constantly, as I am, travelling to a fresh place and looking at them photographically, you're having to mediate, you're having to re-find in each new place you go to the kinds of things that interest you. So in a sense, the place is changing you as you go through it, but in another sense, you're simply relocating or translating into the new context your perennial preoccupations. And I've been around for enough decades now that I really know what I like, and I really know the kind of things that I want to preserve, want to frame. and snap. I mean, I will literally be walking down the street and something will jump out at my eye and say, in a fraction of a second, this is the kind of thing you like, Nick. This is the kind of thing you want to turn into a photograph, isn't it? And I'll say, yes, it is, and I stop and take the picture. So in a way, the camera is already built into my head. If I go back through the history of my photography, I think I started in 1967 with a plastic camera, which my parents bought me, which I don't even remember putting a single film through. I just liked the cool jewellery aspect of having this thing dangling down my front. The next camera I had was functional. It was a Kodak Instamatic. And I shot a few rolls of film, not enormous numbers. My association with that is that I'm at boarding school, and I just get very occasional days out of boarding school. I didn't think of documenting the boarding school itself, if you were even allowed to. I don't know if you were. But I would document days out, so there's pictures of me going to, Flatford Mill or whatever it is, trips with my grandparents, or just day trips and into places where I would take fairly unthought out snaps in front of, castles and other tourist attractions. So I don't think I'd really developed my eye at that point. And then by the mid-70s, I get a Minolta 110 format camera, which is really disappointing. The resolution is terrible, and I'm unable to really take good pictures with that either. Then I go for a long period, several years, without taking any pictures, but then I really get into SLR photography when I'm about 15, 16. The school has a dark room, and I've learned how to develop and print myself, so it's cheaper. So I'm buying Ilford FP4 black and white film. So that's kind of interesting, that in my early enthusiasm for photography, and I joined a thing called the Edinburgh Photographic Society, which is just round the corner from my house on Great King Street. This fusty old organisation which holds international photography exhibitions each year. And I suppose inculcates some ideas about composition, sort of pictorialist 19th century style ideas of what makes a good photographic composition, like having a certain kind of focal point, or receding perspectives, or an S-bend, or a textural interest of an old man's face, or a bicycle rusting away in a field of sedge. Fairly pictorialist ideas of what makes a good photograph, which must have got lodged somewhere in my brain. And I was also looking at magazines like Creative Camera, which were extremely arty, usually black and white photography. But also, the weekly photography press, like Amateur Photographer magazine, which was more about equipment and about technique, and how to do things. So learning about lenses and getting into wide-angle lenses particularly, that became a sort of fetish. And then in the 80s I went for, I basically had to sell my SLR cameras when I ran short of money. I had a Praktica L, and then I had a Fujica Japanese SLR, because they had the same screw mount lenses, I think. And but I had to sell those when I moved to London. I basically didn't have a camera for several years, and I think I got a Polaroid camera to document my sexploits in the late 80s, and then I got video cameras from about 1990 onwards. I was sort of taking a lot of video, but again finding that video is very unsatisfying to watch back. You have these archives which just stack up, and like old TV shows that you've recorded, you often don't get around to even watching them. So they are good for certain things like documenting music gigs or whatever, but I find that all terribly boring to look back through. In a way that I don't find photography. I find the selections I make of my own best still photographs to be endlessly interesting to look back over, whereas video gets boring. So I guess the big moment for me is when still digital photography comes in the late 90s, and I've already got into digital video because I get early, very expensive digital DV cassette video, like the JVC GDVR1, I think it was called, something like that, which could do still photography, but very poor still photography. Then it really boomed for me, digital photography. First of all, I had my eye problems, and I started seeing things depthlessly flat because I was seeing things with just one eye from 97 onwards. And that coincided with the moment when Japanese kids, like there was a guy called Kohei, who was a friend of ours in Paris, a friend of me and Gilles and Florence in Paris, who were bringing from Japan the first, or actually American, they were bringing Apple, what's it called, the Apple digital camera, which could connect to a computer and you could save images onto a floppy disk. These really early primitive digital cameras, which had such poor resolution that really you were forced to take graphic design type images. That was what worked best, was just very flat, very simple, strong graphic images. But then I started buying these Fujifilm digital still cameras, which I really liked, and I went through about 5 of those different iterations of the same family. There was sort of an upright kind of cigarette packet shaped digital camera, which I really used a lot in London from the late 90s onwards till about 2003, 2004, at which time they would have been replaced by more conventional compact digital cameras with usually zoom lenses that were sort of, when you switched on the camera, the zoom lens would pop out with a motorized hum. And then that continued until the advent of the iPhone. And round about the time, I was taking so many iPhone pictures and disappointed always in their quality. So when I got a bit of money when my father died in 2015, I bought this Fujifilm X Pro 1. But I'm not sure that I like carrying a clunky camera like that around. It's too big and it's too conspicuous. So I guess over the decades, I mean, it's a very ad hoc kind of interest. I've had moments when I was really a hobbyist and, you know, learning aspects of the old chemical photography, or it was more just in a kind of notebook where I'd take notes of clothes or take note of cities that I was visiting, do stuff specifically for websites or for blogs. It was always secondary to something, supplementary. It wasn't glossy coffee table photography for its own sake. But I remember meeting Peter Halley from Index magazine, who's a painter actually, who started a magazine, who was really impressed by my photographs, early digital photography in the early noughties, and he actually proposed releasing a CD-ROM, which dates it rather, of my still photography. So if I look at the things I've been shooting here in Yangon, from the moment I arrived here in February, I've been interested in making it look exotic, which it has done. You know, going to the pagodas and things and shooting the touristy things at first, but also the plasticky market things, the Buddhist monks particularly, the French books I've been buying, the brightly coloured plastic, the beautiful fabrics. Plastic chairs are a recurrent theme. I'm sort of collecting those. There are things you collect. I think you're basically a visual collector. I guess I have certain fetishes, certain things that I'm visually collecting. One of the things that taking photographs of things replaces is buying things, actually, buying physical objects. So I notice a lot that the kind of things that once upon a time, if you had the money, you would have bought as souvenirs. Now you just tend to want to photograph. A lot of these fabrics and things, I would never actually dream of buying a bolt of batik, you know, but I would take photographs of it hanging up in a market, and the photograph would be enough. That must be very frustrating for people who make their living from selling actual physical objects, because I think a lot of people must be like me. They're kind of digital shoplifters these days. They don't actually want objects anymore, because objects are just endless hassle, having to be sent around the world or carried in suitcases. Why do that when you can have this totally weightless kind of souvenir, the memory in digital form of what you've seen? So yeah, I wonder to what extent what I'm doing now when I photograph is simply saying, these are my habits, these are my fetishes, this is my sensibility. I really love using this thing called Tumblr collage, which throws my 10 images a day on average up into a kind of grid and makes these random juxtapositions, or fairly random juxtapositions, of the images I've been taking. And when you see them all laid out like that on a kind of light box, you really get a kind of sense of, first of all, it's the best of the best, because these are the choice moments of each particular day. These are the 10 best things you saw that day. the 10 things you wanted to collect. The things that you're constantly homing, you're a sort of homing device, looking for value, looking for things which are valuable, which might just be clutter, you know, it might be visual clutter, but since it's free to collect it, it doesn't cost you anything in weight or in money. Why not? Why not collect it? And why not educate people visually? Perhaps that's a highfalutin way of looking at it, that I'm privileged in a way to be in these interesting places with these bright colours and the constant sunshine. I'm actually injecting a certain kind of brilliance into the lives of people who are in cold, wintry places right now. And that's the usual kind of line you walk with holiday snaps, is that you risk alienating and boring people, because in a way describing your holiday is a bit like describing your dreams. It's very difficult to communicate, and even if you can communicate the wonderfulness of it, this sense of being in paradise every day when you step out of your hotel, it's still very hard to overcome a certain jealousy, envy, or a certain lack of empathy, or the unwillingness to jump into that alternative world, because there is a kind of resistance people feel to other people's good fortune, because it makes you feel shit about yourself, obviously, if you're not having access to all these interesting physical things yourself, not having the privilege of travelling. So I don't know what impression these things make. They don't get a huge number of notes on Tumblr, and just as the videos on YouTube, which often consist of the photographs, don't get huge numbers of likes or views on YouTube either. Occasionally somebody will leave a little nice comment saying, great photography, which is appreciated, because I do think it's it's something that matters to me, that I'm trying to find value, and I'm trying to turn random views of things that I'm seeing in a city into a self-portrait, in a sense, which sounds kind of self-centered, but it's the things. T.S. Eliot has this nice phrase, objective correlative, that he said poetry was a way to find an objective correlative to inner states and feelings. You're describing things out in the world, you're describing little fragments of culture or of experience, but it's all to make an objective correlative to your sense of what matters in life and what you're feeling, experiencing. So photography is even more like that, because you're forced to point a lens outwards from yourself into the world, and the world is full of random shapes and forms and people and things, but you're turning those things into personal symbols, investing them, imbuing them arbitrarily in some senses, and illegitimately also, because you don't own these things, and they don't really mean the things that you're trying to make them mean. For instance, one of the things I'm interested in here in Yangon is a certain kind of perforated architecture, certain kind of heat-oriented architecture which is designed to screen the occupants of a building from the sun and the wind, but not block out fresh breezes. So you get the kind of series of layers of railings and perforated stones, concrete breeze blocks which have big holes in them, and you get a sort of almost a sense of fabrics being used with hard materials. A lot of gates with fancy wrought iron, and then windows which are actually not windows, they don't have glass, they're just kind of again iron grills. And this is actually kind of trendy in the West just now. If you look at Herzog and de Meuron's extension to the Tate Modern, for instance, that uses a lot of Islamic hot country type architecture, in the sense that there's a kind of perforated brick, an incomplete brick kind of veil, almost like a cloche of brick, which covers the outside of a building and allows light to come in, but not to be overwhelming to the occupants. So that's one thing I'm sort of collecting, the way the architecture here does that. It's simply a function of the climate here, the sub-equatorial temperatures all year round. Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff I think about when I look at my photographs, and I wonder if it's sometimes it's getting too much to me, it's too much my own particular fetishes that keep reasserting themselves. but also it's a challenge to find in each new place you go to find things that are you. I mean, I notice there are certain ways to differentiate my vision from other people's vision. I think if you were looking casually through your Tumblr feed and it's my photographs mixed in with a whole bunch of other people's photos, you would very quickly, even without looking at the name at the top of each section, you would know which were my images, because you would recognize fairly quickly my fetishes, my particular things. I tend to, for instance, I go to cities full of cars, but I tend to point my camera away from cars and not show cars, and that's in a way a deception already. It's a selection which is semi-deceptive, but mostly what I'm interested in is Asianness, fluorescent lighting, certain kinds of shadow, certain color combinations, blue, white and red, for instance, green, white and red, purple, anything, old photographs hung up in shop windows which have been faded by the sun. There's a whole list of these things which jump out at my eye, and that's what I'm interested in where that very reflexive response comes from, I guess, and what it's saying about me. Why am I choosing those things to make my kind of self-portrait? It's obviously a function of who I am, where I'm from, and but it's also trying to find yourself in otherness, and to therefore try to partake in the glamour of things which are other. Yeah, that's probably enough of a ramble through photography for today.
Open University.